Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is for you. I'm not sure about that. As Jimmy mentioned, I work with SIL International. It's an international language development organization. Works on literacy, translation, community development, linguistic research in many countries around the world. I lead the non-Roman script initiative, part of our computer development area. And our purpose is to make computers be able to handle some of these complex scripts and writing systems of the world. So I'm interested in the exotic stuff and not just the major languages. I'm a type designer with over 2 decades of experience. I was trained in the Masters in Typeface Design program at the University of Reading in England, where I live and work. And I now teach in that program and have for the last decade or so. And so this is some of the same material that I present to the students there or have at some conferences in the past. And my goal today is to help you add diacritics to your Latin fonts. Although even some of it may be useful for you whether you're working in Gujarati or Thai or something like that. The concepts still are the same. But we'll spend some particular attention to Latin diacritics. So my plan is to take you through some very brief background on Latin script diacritics, where they've come from, where we get them, then jump right into FontLab Studio 5, introduce the basic process and concepts behind creating accented characters, then take a whirlwind journey through some of the design issues, whatever tool you may be using. And then at the end, we'll go back to FontLab and try to put it into practice a little bit more. So now there's very limited time, so I won't get into a lot of technical detail. You can ask some of the questions in the open chat afterwards if you want. So, feel free to save your questions for then.
So Victor, yeah, you're going to show us your whole screen now. Okay, and you're going to shut off the webcam. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for the reminder.
You may want to minimize that. Any meeting sidebar, if you could minimize that. There you go.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, can you see that all okay then?
Looking good now.
Great, thanks, Jimmy. All right, diacritics. What are these things? What are we talking about? Umlauts, rings, macrons, acute, grave, tildes, etc. How did we end up with these things? How do we deal with them? We have all these names for them. We call them accents or diacritics or diacritical marks. These are essential parts of the Latin script and writing system. There are hundreds of languages that cannot be written correctly without them. Yet these things are often overlooked or ignored. Jan Tschichold called them type founders' stepchildren. So, what we're talking about, what is a diacritic? Well, sometimes that's obvious. Here in this example, you see a grave, acute, circumflex, a tilde, umlaut, ring, obvious diacritics or accents. But some of these diacritics may even attach. So are these diacritics or are they integral parts of the letter? That's arguable on whether these are diacritics or not, because they do change from letter to letter and they are integrated into the design. So maybe they're not quite diacritics. But what about something like the cedilla? We think of this as a diacritic, but for many languages, if you speak to someone and talk about a C cedilla and you say, well, the cedilla is an accent, they go, no, it's not. It's a C cedilla. That's what the letter looks like. It's not a combination of two things. So diacritics, the word means that which distinguishes. It's something that distinguishes the letter from the non-accented version. Where do these things come from? Well, the common answer you'll find if you do some Google searching, whatever, is that diacritics came from Estienne's Dictionarium of 1530. Now, that may have been the earliest use of accents for French, but actually this became used much, much earlier. The Romans used diacritics for doubled consonants, abbreviations, and began to be more popular and common in medieval manuscripts. So it's effectively always been part of the Latin script, not a later addition. And here in this example, we see the most common Latin diacritic, the dot on the I. Okay? Its use began as in a similar way that it's used in Latin to indicate doubling, like in the word filii. It was just a flick over the I. And it was useful because it allowed you to save space within this dense Gothic texture and very clearly indicate, well, this is the I, in the midst of this solid rhythm and pattern. Now, soon these things had linguistic use and allowed linguists to reuse that alphabet for languages which are nothing like European languages. So they invented them. They put them on, they added them to the letters to give them other variants, other meanings. It's used for tone to indicate pronunciation differences or stress, things like that. And the result is that fonts today have hundreds and sometimes thousands of accented glyphs. And as we'll see later, it's not just exotic languages. It affects many of the 7,000 languages in the world, millions of people, major languages. And as you'll see, managing that design and production process is a challenge. Now, there are three important concepts that we'll cover today about the production of these things: composites and anchors and builders. Sorry, I had to cough there for a moment. Composites. Composites are not limited to FontLab. They're actually a normal part of all font formats. It's an easy way, an efficient way to build a glyph out of others. You have one shape defined one place, another shape defined in another, and you define a third shape as references to those original shapes. So an A in acute is an A with an acute. And if you change one part, if you decide to change the bowl of the A, then automatically all of the composites that are based on that automatically change. Now, you can create these manually. Let's pop over to FontLab and show you how to do that. Here I have a sample font with just a few glyphs in here. I'll open up the E acute. And to do this, you just right-click, click Add Component. I'll choose the E, hit Return. And yes, that's what I want. Hit Return again. Again, Add Component. Start typing acute. That's the only one. Hit Return. Okay, now I can position it. I can move it around manually. Get it exactly how I want. Return OK. There we go. Now, many of you who are on this webinar, this is very basic to you, and a lot of the technical stuff that I may be covering today may be that way. Sorry about that if it's if this is stuff you've known for decades, but we have different skill levels, and I want to be sure that everybody understands the very basics. So there you go, a composite character. We've built it. Webinar over, right? Well, as you can imagine, doing a whole range of hundreds of diacritics like this is just not going to work very well. So what are the options? There are better ways to do this. In fact, there are many better ways to do this. And that involves using anchors. I'll go back to a presentation. Anchors are special points. They're not real points in the font. And when you generate the font as a TTF or a OpenType font and you open it up, you won't find a point there. So they're not real points in the outline. They are special things that have names. They're marked differently in FontLab because they are different. Sometimes they're called attachment points or anchors. They're given names for reference, and that becomes important so that the programs can refer to them in the So let's go back to FontLab again. Let's add some anchors. Open up the lowercase r. And to add an anchor, I'll just right-click where I want the anchor, choose Add Anchor, and I'll give it a name. Now, there are some kind of industry conventions, and one of them is typically that you call this one Top. You don't have to. You can name it anything you want, but this is pretty common. Let's add one below, right under the stem this time. Add anchor, bottom. So you have a top and a bottom. Okay, let's combine that with something. So let's go into the Caron, open that up, and let's add points here. Let's add an anchor. Let's call this underscore top. Now the underscore really is important. This is the standard way in the industry of indicating that this anchor relates to the anchor on other letters that's called top. So underscore top means the thing that attaches to top. Now, just in case we might want a caron below a letter, I'm also going to give this another anchor, underscore bottom. Now, you first notice these seem to be reversed. But if you think about it, this is exactly what you want, because the way anchors work is when you combine two letters, a base and a diacritic, and they have anchors, the letter will be shifted around vertically and horizontally until the two anchors are right on top of one another. So this top, underscore top, will get placed directly on top of the top on the R. And so thus will appear above it. Now, if I wanted it below, I'd have to have it hang below. And so bottom would be below the stem, and then this would connect at that point. So that's why they're positioned like that. Now let's look at the results. If we open up under Window, go to Panels, Preview, and then go to Anchors, you'll see that we've got something. Now, I do have some other anchors in the font that I've already added, like on the capital L there you can see. If you want to see all the anchors that relate to a particular letter, just select that letter. And you'll see I clicked on the R and you get just the R. So that shows you the results of what you did. It combines that. So what anchors do you need? Typically, most glyphs need only a top and a bottom. Be sure you name them consistently with underscores, even if you call it something else than top or bottom. Use the underscores and add others as needed. For comma caron, you'll see some other examples later on as that I will show you. Now, the placement of these things, you can place them by hand, as I've shown you, but you can also automate the placement of these things. If you think about it, let's say you want to create anchors on all your upper and lowercase glyphs. You want it to be in the center of the letter, and you want it to be at a certain height. And you might want to go in there and tweak that, but this is a good place to start. So, like for example, what we've done is we've used Python scripting to automatically place anchors for us. For draft purposes, we then go in there and manually adjust. And so we have a control file that has glyph name, what sort of anchor we want, and what level that anchor should be at. And it just goes through, figures out the center of the bounding box of the glyph, and places it at that point. That's just how we've done it internally. It's not a script that we've made available. RoboFab also includes accent builder tools. There are other ones available. Ben Keel did a nice tool for this some years ago, and it's available there from benkeel.com/type design. Okay. So, how can you use anchors to create the glyphs that you need? This is what we get into builders. We've talked about composites. We've talked about anchors. Now, how do you build the glyphs? Let's go back to FontLab. We'll close the panel, get it out of the way. In the glyph menu, you'll find a command called generate glyphs. What this will do is this creates glyphs that you want in the font, or it'll recreate them. So if I choose that, you can give it a list of glyph names, and then when you hit OK, it'll create those glyphs for you. And if you, over here in the bottom right, there's a checkbox that says replace existing glyphs. If you do that, then it'll just update and change what's there. It'll blow away what you've got and replace it. Now, the way you use this to create things is you could just put R plus Karen, or R plus comma below. Okay, and you can see the letters there. I'm just going to hit OK. And there you are, 2 new glyphs in the font that are constructed that way. You can open them up, and you can see that they're composites. Now, 2 things you'll notice about this that you need to consider. We just said R plus Karen, right? Now, if you remember, the R had both top and bottom anchors, and the Karen had both underscore top and underscore bottom. So why did it place it above and not below? Well, this is one thing. FontLab has some built-in assumptions on how certain letters are constructed. So it sort of assumes, okay, you're wanting this to be on the top. And those assumptions are really helpful. Once in a while, they get you into trouble, but you can override that manually. But generally, FontLab's assumptions are good on this. So that saves you a little bit of work. Just like it, notice that the comma below should go below. The other thing you'll notice is that this glyph has a rather strange glyph name. It's called R plus Karen. That's not a legal glyph name in PostScript. So you need to change that. So there are 2 ways of dealing with that. Let's get rid of these again. Delete those. Go to glyph, generate glyphs. You can also just type R Karen, and it gets it right. Because R Karen is a standard PostScript name for a character. It's a predefined in the Adobe glyph list, and FontLab knows how to construct that character. And that's set in a control file that you can actually go and edit. If you read the documentation in the FontLab manual, you can find out about that. So you can do it that way, and then it'll get the name right. Or let's say you want to give it a really wacky name. You could just R plus Karen equals, and then give it whatever you want. And call it Fred. And when you hit OK, there you go. You have a glyph called Fred. Now, what you can also do under Generate Glyphs is in this little corner here, you see a folder icon. You can load a file of glyph definitions. And this is a really nice thing to do. You can build up your own text file of glyph definitions, and rerun it every time you make changes, and keep doing replace existing glyphs, and it'll just keep all your glyphs up to date. That's very nice. Now, there is another way to do this too, though. We've talked about these assumptions. FontLab. You can do it with Python, just like you can with the setting of the accents. And there are actually a lot of custom Python tools that build composites. Many packages, RoboFab has something. We have our own tool called FL Glyph Builder. We have made this available from scripts.sil.org/flglyphbuilder. It's based on an XML syntax and handles complex attachments, shifts. It really is intended as a high-powered production tool with a lot of power and flexibility. And so the XML does get a little verbose. So I think our XML definitions for our main Roman fonts are over 25,000 lines. So it does get complex. But that's available if you want. That's sort of the far end of the scale in terms of doing that. All right, that gives you the basics about composites, anchors, and builders, and how to use FontLab's built-in tools to create them. But I've also given you some look at some other more flexible options, and we'll come back and take a look at another example a bit later. But for now, I want to switch over and talk about the design issues. Now, I'll compress this a bit, but if you want to have a broader view of this information, you can go look at my dissertation from many years ago from University of Reading. If you just Google for Gaultney diacritics, you'll find it. It's the first thing that comes up. Now, when you're designing Latin diacritics, there are 5 basic design challenges that you're going to face. Asymmetry, width harmony, vertical spacing, capitals, and cultural preferences. And we'll take each one of these, starting with asymmetry. Balance is important in type design. Imbalance can be disruptive to the reader. And it's subtle but important, especially for diacritics. If you have the diacritic off a little bit, the whole letter looks like it's tilted slightly. It's offset in an odd way. So the fundamental question is, I have a diacritic, I have a base character. How do I align the two of them? Now, to be honest, I struggled with this because my language doesn't use diacritics except for the dot on the I for the most part. Now, it's pretty simple when the base character and the diacritic are both symmetric. You just center them both, right? Easy enough. But what if the diacritic is asymmetric? How do you do that alignment? Do you just center it? Well, that doesn't usually quite look right. But what if the base character is the one that's asymmetric? One clue for this comes from the work of David Kindersley. He is a letter carver, a student of Eric Gill, and he sought automatic means of spacing letters for signage, the famous metal street signs that populate every city, town, or village here in the UK. And he sought an automatic means for spacing those letters, something that a blue-collar worker who was creating these metal street signs, every one of them individually, could get it right without having to be have his eye trained to, see the spacing exactly right. So he tried to quantify what good spacing was. And a part of the key to his alignment was the concept of an optical center. So what's the optical center? There are some options that he explored. Imagine this letter, this capital C here, balanced on a fulcrum. How would you place that on the tip of the fulcrum so that it didn't lean over in either direction? Well, you could base that on the area, the amount of black within the C. You could base it on the mathematical middle of the letter from the sides. You could balance it in terms of inertia. If you consider it out like an object that has weight or gravity. So there are different moments, as they call them, centers of gravity that you could use. And these things can be mathematically estimated. So how does this apply to diacritics? Is instead of just centering letters on one another, you take the optical center of the diacritic and align it with the optical center of the base character. Well, that can help, but it's not the complete answer, really. Taking this a bit further, counters are really important, and the visual importance and effect of the size and the shape and the location of that counter has been shown to be very critical to the way we perceive the letter. So my suggestion is that you take the optical center of the diacritic and align it with the optical center of the counter. And often this results in sort of the best alignment of all. Now, there are times when this optical alignment doesn't apply, such as with these. Are these even diacritics? Maybe not. In the case like the ogonek, you really need to design that as part of the letter, not as something you slap on. But what about these rhotic marks on the bottom? Those are very much diacritics, but they're certainly not centered or anything. But what if the base is not symmetric? Like the D with the dot. The mathematical gives you much too close spacing. The optical is still too close. So the best is to use your eye and adjust. In the case of the R, diacritics that are aligned above the R probably need to be aligned, centered within the top half of the letter, and ones below on the bottom half, so they rest under the stem. So a mixed approach is best. And this just shows that you need to use your eyes to adjust whatever systems you use. But what if the diacritic itself is asymmetric? The acute and the grave is the most common example of this. And how should these be aligned? People argue about this. Well, there are three methods. The first two that I'll show you were based on imagining a line that goes through the optical center of the base character. The first, the just through rule, says you take the acute or grave going the other way and push it just through the center, just slightly over the center. This seems to be preferred by French designers. That's just the cultural preference. There's also the 1/3, 2/3 rule, and this is one that was used at monotype and linotype, which says you take 1/3, the lower 1/3, stick it through, and leave the other 2/3 on the other side. The results can be very different, but this is, again, truly visual. A third way of thinking about it, though, involves looking at the angle of slope. Now, if you have an acute and grave that are very vertical, it tends to look better with the just through rule. That's typical alignment. But if you take that same diacritic and make it much more shallow, make it flatter, the just through rule just doesn't look right. It looks wrong. So it's better to push that farther towards the center. So you have to consider the angle of your diacritics to determine how far, what the alignment should be. Now, historically, this gets very interesting with the acute. If we look at this throughout centuries, the acute was very vertical, highly vertical, throughout all the way up through the 19th century. Now, when you get to the 20th century, things change, particularly in the late metal and early phototypesetting era. Suddenly you got a shift in style. And Fotina, created at that time, shows a real clear change from the highly vertical. And you can see they're a lot flatter there. Now, you see this in a lot of faces. And certain faces that had highly vertical ones got changed. Here are 3 versions of Caledonia. First on the left is metal, and this middle one is the early first digital versions, and the third one on the right is later digital version. And you see that's lost. And now it's a matter of style. We see a mix. So what do? You design whatever's appropriate. You consider the language, and we'll get back to this. You can also use new technologies, OpenType and Graphite, to choose. Like my original Gentium font had 2 versions of diacritics for different purposes and uses. All right, moving on to the next, width harmony. Now, even if you have your diacritics perfectly aligned, they can run into other glyphs, so you need to consider the letters around. Now, the simplest of these is the FI ligature. Typical solution to this is you strip off the dot, extend the F. However, there are other ways of doing it. Jean-François Porchez did a very creative one with Parisine, where he actually he shortened the F to match. And that also then worked well for the L as well. So don't always assume that you have to do things in a certain way and work this problem out the same way that others do. It is important, though, because what if the I has 2 dots? If it's a dieresis or an umlaut, or a circumflex, and it's a very thin character. This is a real Turkish word, and you can see immediately the problems that you have to think through. Problem gets worse in bold and sans serif. There's just not enough space for it. Dieresis is the most difficult one here, but the tilde can be a problem as well. So what can be done? For the acute, the grave and the circumflex, you can adjust the angle of slope. This is not just a slightly modern creative idea. This was actually, you can see this in De Etna, one of the first printed books using the metal type. And if you look through the book, I mean, the type is hand cut, and so there is some variation of this, but there is a general trend that the diacritics over the thin letters, like the I, are more upright than those over the wider letters. Now, these were cut as single pieces, so that the I acute was one piece of type, the A acute was one piece of type. So they had the flexibility to adjust. This has been also done in the 20th century. Melior and Dante, Mardersteig and Zapp did this. You could also vary the length of the macron. You don't see many examples of this, but it could be useful. Finally, you could also use kerning. I'll rush on through this. The next issue, vertical spacing. Here, compare the height of the I dot and the dieresis. Take a look at Galliard on the top. This looks to be an intentional difference. Matthew Carter let the dot on the I ride up high because it matched the lively character of the font. But if you were to stick the dieresis up at that same level, it would exaggerate the space and look like it was starting to disconnect from the letter. And it would also interfere with the ascenders. Now, other changes seem less purposeful. You see these odd, strange variants in gill sans in the various weights. And this was just because different designers worked on things at different times and they made different decisions. But it's this sort of inconsistency that you want to avoid. The apparent inconsistency in Galliard is a bit different. That seems a bit more purposeful. Well, so how do you vertically align things? One thing I will mention particularly about the dot and the dieresis is they can be treated differently. Generally, when you're starting out in a font, you probably want to make the dieresis to be identical to 2 I dots and then adjust from there. But if it's a calligraphic face, you may want to do something a little bit different, and you can make them different. So now to vertical alignment. Again, there are 2 general alignment strategies here. You can take what was typically done at monotype, which is align the bottoms of all the diacritics. Just stick them all, no matter what their height, just align them. And you see this in Arial and Times New Roman and things from monotype in that era. And it's interesting to note that this isn't the case with linotype times. So this was something particular to monotype. The other thing you can do is do what you see in Palatino linotype, which is you align the centers of them all. A wiser strategy is what Matthew Carter used in Charter, which is a mixed strategy. You have a bottom baseline that by default they all sit on, kind of like monotype's way of doing things. But then you balance that with having some of the diacritics that are flatter raised up so that you get a more natural feel of alignment. And that's why I'd recommend that you do. Well, what if you have multiple diacritics? If you have a language that uses dieresis and acute, or a tilde and acute or something, one thing you can do is if you're designing your font for that specific purpose, build in the space for it. You know, Adobe Garamond has more space than Rotus Serif has for another diacritic on the top here. You can also change the diacritics to take up less space. In my Gentium alternate font, the double diacritics are flatter and spaced more closely together. You can then also redesign some as composite symbols. This is typically what's done for Vietnamese. Now, there are also diacritics below that you need to think about. The only thing I'll say about these is the same diacritic doesn't need to take the same shape when it's below a letter. The shape doesn't have to be the same. They should relate, but it's more important that the diacritics below relate to the descenders in a similar way that the diacritics above relate to the ascenders. Here's one fun example. What Ladislas Mandel did for telephone books. Now this is extremely small type, very, very small type. And he knew that shrinking the diacritics were not an option because they'd just disappear. And so he actually shrunk the base characters. He shrunk the lowercase e for Noel. He shrunk the uppercase e for Noguet. Now, this looks odd when it's enlarged, but when you see it at real size, it works phenomenally well. So use creative solutions like that if you need to. Speaking of capitals, what do you do with accents on capitals? Most of the time, there is no difference between lowercase and uppercase accents. However, most successful designs do alter the shape and make the uppercase diacritics a bit flatter. Metal types had more vertical accents traditionally. It was necessary to shorten and flatten them on the capitals so they'd fit on the body. Now, that was a technical limitation, but it's not necessarily the only motivation there, and this is still common in types that harken back to traditional styles. Unfortunately, we've seen that the very rocky transition from metal to photo and digital often lost these nice differences. As we saw that with Caledonia earlier, Sabon here, the top line, the original hot metal, had a very clear difference. A difference that works well in print. Unfortunately, Adobe's version of Sabon just gave them sort of generic accents that look like they're not even from Sabon whatsoever. Monotype tried to do something that was a little more stylish and fit the style, but they got it all wrong. The ones on the capitals, they're far too high. Now, thankfully, Sabon Next, done some years ago by Jean-François Porchez, restored the difference well. Now, you can also use some other techniques. I won't get into, spend a lot of time on this, but you can actually reduce the size of the cap like Mundell did for the phone books. Georg Trump did that for Shadow Antiqua. You can also, in some cases, connect it onto the letter for like Antico Livre. It works. In fact, the A ring is very commonly connected to the capital A. So you'll see that quite a lot. If you want to see some really interesting things, go take a look at that dissertation that I mentioned. Just Google Gaultney diacritics. There are some fantastic examples of German umlauts and what they did for that. It's a wonderful style and some very interesting issues. One last technique I'll say is if you need more space for diacritics above capitals, just design the capitals to be slightly shorter. This has been somewhat in style anyway, and it's also helpful for some languages like German that have a lot of capitals. Okay, finally, looking at cultural preferences, we'll go through this pretty quickly. Each of these problems has so far had a linguistic or cultural dimension. So one final challenge is to design the language to match your design with the language. You know, the design of an ogonek depends on whether you're talking about Polish or Lithuanian. And the stacking of a circumflex with acute is different whether you're talking about Vietnamese or African languages. Now, there's a strong tendency for we as designers to focus and specialize in local features, the way we and our main clients want to see it. But these days, our markets are much broader, so we need to be thinking more internationally. Here are some examples where cultural preference affects your design. There are some diacritics that look similar, but are actually different. I talked about the umlaut and the dieresis, and you see a difference between that, particularly for German. But in the case of the cedilla, there are 3 different forms of the cedilla, and they pattern in terms of what they look like by language. Here's another example. The Polish kreska looks like an acute, acts like an acute, walks like an acute, but it's not an acute. It tends to be more upright. And Adam Twardach has some good documents online. If you just search for Twardach Polish diacritics, you'll see this example and a whole load of others that gives you really good advice on how to design that. But I say these things are not necessarily the same. And for Czech, the charka, which is also kind of like an acute, is even different and is normally flat on the top. And the Hacek, that you see on the right on the bottom line, that's not just an inverted circumflex. That's a different letter with, as you can see, with a very different vocabulary of design. Now that's a very particular national style that you may or may not want to emulate. Another cultural issue is the size of the diacritic. Which of these looks to be the right size? Think about it for a moment. Most people would say the middle one, but it all depends on what the role in the language is. If you take French text and you eliminate all the accents, it's still readable. It's not correct, but you can still read it just fine. However, for Yoruba, in this example, if you take away all these accents, it's gibberish. It's not understandable at all, because those accents carry just as much weight and importance of meaning as the letters themselves. And for that reason, for Yoruba, they need strong, clear accents. It's interesting, Ovink, a pioneer in legibility studies many years ago, one of his many studies, he found that the shape of the dot on the I was less important than its pure size. So what do you do with this? You can make variants like I did with Gentium. There were national versions of Times New Roman. Vox cut a French version of Times New Roman to make it more like the Roman du Roi, to make it more acceptable to French audiences. Monotype cut a version of Times New Roman for the German market with lighter weight caps. So you can do specialized versions, or like in this case, this example, you can try to balance out the needs. Palatino linotype works well for both an acute and a Polish kreska. And this makes the font more useful to a variety of markets. So you can do it this way, or you can go for a particular national style. This is a very strong Czech style by Menhart, a really lovely design, but very particular to an old Czech style. Okay, so closing this section out, as you look forward, do your homework. Decide what's your market for your diacritics. Why are you putting them in your font? What are you trying to accomplish? Think multilingually and internationally. Innovate when you need to solve those problems, and embrace new technologies. All right. After all that, let's go back to FontLab again. You can wake up now. Let's take another look at some of these concepts. I'm going to switch over to a different font here. This is a font Andika Basics. It's for literacy work around the world. Very, simplified forms intended for high legibility, readability, for teaching new readers. As you can tell, there are a lot of letters in this font. Almost 1,000. This is actually smaller. This is a subset of a font that has over 4,000. All the green characters you see here are composite characters. They're defined separately in a text file, and every time we build this font, that we generate it, we rerun that composite generation. So it goes through and updates all of these letters. Stick that to index mode, and so you can see more names. It's a little easier for what we're going to do. All right. Things I want to show you here is, with this being a bigger font, if I open up the E and go to the preview panel, well, before we do that, I've opened up the E, and you can see that there are 5 anchors here. There's the U on the top, the L on the bottom. That's just because, for 20 years we've used U and L rather than top and bottom. But there are also three others here, R, an O, and an H, and I'll show you what those are for. Okay, now if you open up the preview panel, you see here all the different diacritic combinations that have an underscore U that could be combined with the E. Now you see in this case, I have, because this is a font for literacy purposes, the diacritics are really strong and bold and large. It just helps in terms of legibility, the distinctiveness of the characters, and it's part of the purpose of the font. But this is a very nice way to kind of review and say, what's the diacritic alignment look like on my E? But up here you can choose which anchor you want to look at. You can look at the L, and you'll see what gets connected under there. The R is used just for that little kind of whisker. It's called a horn, used for Vietnamese. Here's the ogonek, although in most of our fonts that's designed as a separate character. But sometimes this ogonek is placed on other letters that are not used in Central Europe, so we need to have that. And the H is for this cedilla, because that's placed on other characters as well. So those are our 5 anchors, and that shows you how those constructed glyphs are going to look. So now let's instead scroll down here to the combining acute, and you can see that's this letter here. And you can see 2 anchors on that, the underscore U and the U. And up here in the preview panel, I'll choose the underscore U. Now if we pull that over, or if we untick some of these things on the side, that shows you the alignment of that particular diacritic over all these different letters. So this is how you can review that. Now, say you looked at this and you found that and you said, oh, well, all of the acutes are far too left. What do? What do you change? If you move the anchors on the base letters, that would work, but then that would also affect the others. If you change the anchor on top of the capital E, all of the diacritics would be shifted, not just this one. Now, what you can do is you can actually just move the outline. You can select the outline and shift it. And you can see that shifting in the preview window. Maybe that's a little too far. Let me go back. Okay, that looks a little bit better. Might still not be ideal, but we'll just leave it there for now. So you can move the outline, but you may actually in some cases want to move the anchor itself, in which case you just select it, you click, and you move it. You can move it all around, but if you hold down the Shift key, it'll keep it in the same plane, which is useful. And if you let go, you'll see the change. That's nice. You can also change that by going to the glyph property, going to properties. If you right-click on the anchor, go to properties, you can adjust its position. It's 500. And you can see that change. So you can get more precision in doing that. Now note an important difference here. If you move the acute outline, all the current composites throughout the font will be affected live, just like you're seeing it in the preview window. So if you move the outline, it'll shift for all those other green characters, all the composites. Now, if you move the anchor instead, that's not going to affect all your existing composites. Nothing will be changed until you use the generate glyphs command again to sort of rebuild those composites. And that's a big important difference. If you want to manage your composites by adjusting anchors, realize that when you move the anchor, it's not going to automatically change your composites for you. You still need to go in and rerun generate glyphs or whatever tool you're using to do that. Now, you may think by looking at this that moving the outline is always the best answer. Well, it's not always, and I won't get into all the details because we're sort of running out of time. But as I mentioned before, what we do is we use anchors very heavily, and we do all our adjustments with the anchors for the most part. And we just rebuild the composites every time we generate the font in a production build. So, in summary, a good practice here is when you're setting up your anchors and composites and things, first thing to do is to place anchors at the optical center of your base glyph counter. Go through your lowercase glyphs, determine what's the optical center of that counter, and place that at a specific point where it might be 1100 units in TrueType, or might be 500 in PostScript, all at that same vertical level aligned with the base character. And then do the same for the diacritics. Put it at that same height, put that underscore top at the same height, and align it with the optical center of the diacritic. Start from there, and then build all your diacritics. See what you get. Then go back, start with the lowercase o, and test the alignment of your individual diacritics. Go through one by one. Use that preview panel to look at, do I need to does the acute need to be further to the right? Does the grave need to be to the left? How do I need to adjust this? And adjust your diacritics to work. Then, once you've got that working well for the lowercase o, then go a diacritic at a time and see where that, flip it around. Choose the circumflex and look at how it looks over all the lowercase letters. And then make adjustments to the base anchors if there are any particular ones that look like they're off. And in some situations, you're going to have to manually fix a combination. But just be careful if you're using a script or something to rebuild your diacritics that your manual work will get blown away if you do that. Okay, well, look at that. I've kept it to exactly an hour. I guess we'll just leave it there and open it up for chat from here.
Wow, thanks a million, Victor. I feel like I'm not worthy to be in the same hemisphere with you. That was fantastic. What we usually do with the questions, Victor, is to have people put them in the chat, and then we'll take them on as they come in through the chat window. And,
okay, let me get that back up so I can see it.
Renee says your voice is soothing. Yeah.
Oh, imagine clouds.
Okay. Well, if anybody has any questions, we've got Victor while we got the opportunity here. I mean, you just kind of took our breath away, getting a lot of good compliments there. I hope you don't get a swelled head now. I was pretty fascinated.
Oh, thank you, Andrea.
I was pretty fascinated by the way you do that because I was curious if you use the anchor method, then what if you didn't like one of those? Do you have to get out of the anchor mode to fix that, just that one?
Well, what we do is in our production systems, if we find after we've tweaked all the anchors, the thing is, if you tweak the anchor on the O, that affects the alignment of all of the diacritics. If you change the anchor on the acute, that affects the alignment of the acute with all the base letters. But what if you have one particular combination that you just want to tweak?
Yeah.
Like that D dot.
Yeah.
Well, then I just manually go in there and I move the components. But then I go back and I remove that from the list of composites that I will build automatically.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see we have a question there from Friedrich.
Let me see here. Oh, I'm having trouble scrolling here.
I think you have to scroll back. It's about the Unicode for the acute and the acute comb.
Okay, let's see.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah. There are two, in Unicode. There are sometimes two different versions of diacritics. The thing that's in the kind of Latin one that you see, that's the 00B4. There's an acute and the circumflex there, things like that. Those are standalone. They're spacing things. They're not meant to be combined with other letters. The things that are up in the 03XX range, those are what are called combining diacritics. And in Unicode, they are used for things which should rest on top of the previous letter. So, for example, and let's take a combination that we know isn't in Unicode. I'm trying to think of one that I for sure know isn't in Unicode. Let's take an S with a macron. I don't think there is anything like that. That would be in your text. You would type that as an S and then a combining macron. If you were to just use the macron from the 00 section, they technically shouldn't combine. They would be sitting next to each other. So the right way to do this is you define your combining character so that with zero width, so that it rests automatically on top of the previous letter. And then for those slots in the lower bits, the 00 range, you just make a composite character, shift it into and give it some space. That's what I'd recommend.
And next we have James Maltabano.
Hey, hello, James. Yes, the placement of, in Vietnamese, when you have the circumflex and the grave, do you stick it on the left or the right-hand side? There's actually a long story on this, and it has to do with political allegiances. And so I won't get into all of that, but generally, if I recall, the standard practice these days is to just stick it on the right, or the acute, circumflex acute goes off to the right, circumflex grave goes off to the left, and it's very short.
Okay, so we have Carolyn wants to know about what you think about the cedilla.
The cedilla is very interesting because in French there's a very classic design that looks a bit like the bottom half of a 5. And that's generally acceptable, and people say, well, that's what it looks like. You can actually get a little more creative with it. Even going back historically, there are good examples of a cedilla that is disconnected and looks more like almost a comma underneath. And there are some languages for which, if you actually look in Unicode, like Romanian, things like this, where they have a letter that's called Sadia, but actually the correct form of that is a comma-like version underneath. It's not really a comma, but it's that general shape. So, you can understand that for French, yeah, the connected 5-like shape is pretty standard, but you can be a little flexible.
Okay, do you have anything about transliterated Arabic for Matthew there?
Well, what you can do is you can look at the fonts that we've done. If you go to scripts.sil.org/Gentium, you will get to Gentium plus our current version of Gentium. Plus, we also have fonts Keras, Andika, Doulos, of different styles. You can take a look at what we did there. I'm not saying that what we did is perfect, but it's certainly what we think is probably most acceptable. Yeah.
That's a good suggestion. I'm not sure what the standalone accent.
When does one use the standalone accent? The only reason why you would use this, that 00B4 and others like it, is if you want to display the accent on its own, not connected with a letter. There are actually some situations where you want things like that, but they're rare. The main reason why they're in Unicode the way they are is for historical, technical legacy reasons. Technically, you just shouldn't use them.
Okay, I see Ken is next.
And what question is that? I'm not quite catching.
Non-combining diacritics.
Yeah. We've done them, I think, in our fonts. I think we did them wrong. I would do them wrong, but it's be quite an effort to do them right. What I recommend is that you make the combining diacritics, the 03XX range, make those your outlined, your standard ones. And then other variants and things, make them composites of that. So use the combining diacritic as your component.
Okay, what do you think about overlapping the diacritics?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. To overlap the diacritics on
maybe like the A ring. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you can do that if you need space. Unless you have a particular reason for doing it, it looks a little odd.
Okay. Do you know the difference between Polish? There was one there.
Polish and Lithuanian. Typically it's design and placement. If you go and look, search for Adam Twardoch's. That's Twardoch. Look for his information on Polish diacritics. The other thing you can do is, I'm not sure if this is linked on there, but if you go to scriptsource.org, scriptsource.org, and search for that particular, if you just search for ogonek or something, you may find something there. That's our website dedicated to writing systems and scripts, and we've got a lot of different things linked on that site. So you may find something there on it.
Okay. It looks like that was the last question. And If you do have any other questions, you can go ahead and email me, jim@fontlab.com, and we'll try to find an answer for you. You got a standing ovation there, Victor. So I was wondering, would we have to lodge a protest with the UK to get you to come back someday?
Just let me know what your questions are, and I'll see.
Okay. Well, we'll give you say a year off for good behavior, and maybe sometime we'll invite you back again.
Oh, that's very kind, Jim.
Okay. Well, thanks for doing this, and we will debrief later.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for sticking around and for listening, and I really hope it's been helpful for you. So,
good stuff.
Best wishes.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.